The morning mist clung to the Vosges mountains like a shroud, and Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched behind a fallen oak, studying the tree line ahead through field glasses that kept fogging in the December cold. His platoon had been moving through these French hills for 3 days, chasing reports of a German supply column that intelligence insisted was somewhere in this valley. But Murphy's gut told him something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, too perfect, like a stage set waiting for actors to appear. The radio crackled from Private Martinez's pack. Captain Crawford's voice cut through the static, sharp with impatience. The German counter-offensive in the Vosges had stalled Allied progress for weeks, and every intelligence report about enemy movements had become precious. But sitting here in the wet leaves, watching his breath fog in the January air, Murphy felt the familiar weight of orders that didn't match the ground truth. "Sir, the men are getting antsy," Sergeant Johnson whispered, sliding up beside him through the wet leaves. "We've been sitting here 20 minutes. Maybe we should push forward to that ridge line." Murphy lowered his glasses and wiped the condensation away with a dirty sleeve. Around them, 18 soldiers from his platoon waited in the underbrush, their faces pale with cold and exhaustion. They'd been in combat for 6 weeks straight in the Vosges mountains, moving from one anonymous hill to another, always hungry, always tired, always trusting that someone above them knew what they were doing. Most of them were barely old enough to shave, farm boys from Texas and Oklahoma who'd joined up thinking war would be like the movies. Down the slope, maybe 400 meters away, Murphy could see the twisted remains of a tank destroyer that had been hit during yesterday's action. The M10's hull was blackened and split open, but something about its position bothered him. It sat at a perfect choke point where the forest road bent toward the ridgeline, too convenient, too obvious a landmark for an ambush. "Something's not right about this," Murphy said, his voice barely audible above the wind through the pines. "That ridgeline's too obvious. If I were setting up an ambush, that's exactly where I'd put my machine guns." Johnson frowned and looked ahead through the trees. The ridgeline Murphy was studying ran along the eastern edge of the valley, a natural defensive position that overlooked the only road their maps showed leading to the supposed German supply depot. Command had been clear in their orders: advance to that high ground, establish observation, and call in artillery if they spotted enemy movement. Behind them, Private Kowalski shifted nervously, his M1 Garand cradled against his chest. At 19, he was one of the newer replacements, still jumpy at every sound that might be incoming artillery. Murphy had seen that look before, the wide eyes of someone who'd realized that all the training in the world couldn't prepare you for the moment when other men were actively trying to kill you. "Lieutenant," came Martinez's voice from behind them. "Captain's on the horn again, wants to know our position and why we haven't reached the objective." Murphy took the handset, his eyes still scanning the forest ahead. Even through the static, he could hear the impatience in Captain Crawford's voice. The captain was a good officer, but he was sitting in a command post 3 miles back, looking at maps instead of terrain, thinking in terms of timetables and grid coordinates instead of the subtle wrongness that experienced infantry learned to feel in their bones. The destroyed tank destroyer seemed to watch them from its position below, its gun barrel twisted skyward at an unnatural angle. Something about the way the morning light hit its hull made Murphy think of a spider waiting in its web. The 3rd Infantry Division had lost too many good men in the Vosges already, and Murphy wasn't eager to add his platoon to that count. "Red 6, this is Red 2, Murphy said into the radio. "We're approximately 200 meters from the ridgeline, but I'm seeing signs this might be a setup. Request permission to swing south and approach from a different angle." The response came back sharp and immediate. Intelligence reports were definitive. The German supply column was scheduled to move through this valley within the hour. Every minute they delayed gave the enemy more time to escape. The mission parameters were clear: reach the ridgeline, establish observation, complete the objective. The fate of the entire sector's operations might depend on this single reconnaissance mission. Murphy handed the radio back to Martinez, feeling the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Around him, his men waited with the patient exhaustion of soldiers who'd learned not to question orders, even when those orders felt like stepping into a grave. These were the same boys who'd followed him through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula, who'd trusted his judgment when it meant the difference between going home and going into the ground. The wind shifted through the pine branches, carrying the distant smell of diesel fuel and something else, cordite maybe, or the lingering scent of burned metal from yesterday's fighting. Murphy found himself staring again at the wrecked tank destroyer, wondering if its crew had felt this same sense of walking into a trap before the German guns found them. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Johnson, take half the squad and move along the western slope, Murphy said finally, his decision made. Stay low, stay quiet, and if you see anything that doesn't look right, you get on the radio immediately. We'll approach from 2 angles. But even as he gave the order, Murphy's instincts continued screaming warnings. The way the morning light fell through the trees created perfect shadows for concealment, the absence of bird sounds that should have been echoing through these Vosges forests. The fact that their approach route felt too convenient, too much like a funnel leading exactly where the enemy would want them to go. As Johnson's team disappeared into the underbrush, Murphy led the remaining 9 men forward through a shallow ravine that offered some concealment. The January cold bit through their wool overcoats, and frost crunched under their boots despite their efforts to move quietly. Every step felt like walking deeper into a trap, but orders were orders, and somewhere behind them, Captain Crawford was monitoring their progress on his tactical maps. Private Kowalski stumbled on a route, his equipment rattling. Murphy caught his arm, steadying the young soldier while scanning the tree line ahead. Easy, son. Just like training, remember? But it wasn't like training at all. In training, the enemy didn't really want to kill you. In training, you didn't have to live with the consequences of being wrong. Here in the Vosges Mountains, with the German winter offensive stalled but not broken, every mistake could mean a wooden box shipped back to some farm in Oklahoma or Texas. They were 50 meters from the ridgeline when Murphy saw it. A glint of metal among the pine boughs, gone so quickly he almost convinced himself it had been sunlight on a wet branch. But training and 6 months of combat in the 3rd Infantry Division had taught him to trust those half-second glimpses that separated the living from the dead. He raised his hand, freezing his men in place, and brought his field glasses up one more time. There, carefully camouflaged among the rocks and vegetation along the ridgeline, were the distinctive shapes of machine gun positions. At least 3, possibly 4, with interlocking fields of fire that would turn the open slope ahead into a killing ground. Behind them, Murphy could make out the shadowy figures of German soldiers, waiting with the infinite patience of hunters who knew their prey was walking straight into the trap. "Jesus," whispered Private Torres, who'd crawled up beside Murphy. "How many you think are up there?" "More than we want to fight head-on," Murphy murmured, lowering the glasses. The burned-out tank destroyer below them suddenly made more sense. It had probably tried to support an attack on this same position yesterday, and the German gunners had been ready for it. Now they were using its hulk as bait, knowing that American infantry would have to pass close by to reach their objective. The radio crackled again. Martinez looked up from where he crouched behind a fallen log, shaking his head. "Captain wants a sit-rep, Lieutenant. Says we're running out of time." Murphy stared down at the destroyed M10, its guns still pointing toward the enemy positions like an accusation. The crew inside had probably died, following orders just like these: advance to contact, establish observation, complete the objective. Now their tank destroyer sat as a monument to the gap between what commanders wanted and what the ground would allow. From his left, Johnson's voice whispered over the radio. Red 2, this is Red 2 Alpha. I count at least 6 Krauts in positions along the western approach. They've got us zeroed in. The trap was complete then. The Germans had probably been watching them since they entered the valley, letting them walk deeper into the killing ground before revealing themselves. Murphy felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the terrible weight of responsibility for the 18 lives depending on his next decision. "What's the play, Lieutenant?" Sergeant Johnson's voice came through the handset, barely audible, but carrying the trust that frontline soldiers placed in their leaders. Behind that trust was the unspoken understanding that Murphy had brought them this far alive through Sicily, Italy, and now France. They'd follow him wherever he decided to go, even if it killed them. Murphy looked back at his men, faces dirty and stubbled, eyes alert but tired, weapons ready but probably inadequate for what lay ahead. Kowalski still looked scared, but he'd stayed in position when the shooting started yesterday. Torres had the steady expression of a soldier who'd learned to expect the worst and keep moving anyway. Martinez hunched over his radio, ready to call for artillery or air support that might not come in time. The wrecked tank destroyer seemed to mock their situation. Its crew had probably radioed back confident reports right up until the moment German shells started falling. Now it sat twisted and blackened, a reminder that good soldiers died following bad plans, and that sometimes the difference between heroism and suicide was thinner than the margin of a tactical map. Murphy closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind through the pines and the distant rumble of artillery from some other sector of the Vosges front. When he opened them again, his decision was made, though he wasn't sure yet whether it would save his men or doom them all. The decision crystallized when Murphy heard the sound, the low rumble of tracked vehicles moving through the forest, still distant but getting closer. The German supply column was real, and it was heading straight for this valley, just as intelligence had predicted. But so was the trap, waiting for any American forces trying to intercept it. "Johnson, can you see anything moving down the valley road?" Murphy whispered into the radio. The response came back tense. "Affirmative. Looks like a half-track and maybe 2 trucks, still about a click out. But, Lieutenant, if we try to call in artillery from here, those machine guns are going to cut us to pieces." Murphy studied the tactical problem through his field glasses. The German convoy would pass right by the destroyed tank destroyer, using the forest road that curved beneath the ridgeline. From their current position, his platoon could observe and direct fire, exactly as ordered. But the moment they broke radio silence or tried to move to better firing positions, the German gunners would open up. It was a perfect tactical dilemma: follow orders and probably die, or withdraw and let a valuable enemy convoy escape. The kind of impossible choice that turned young lieutenants into casualties or legends, with very little middle ground between them. Private Martinez crawled forward, his radio handset crackling with another transmission from Captain Crawford. "Lieutenant, battalion's asking for our report. They want to know if we have eyes on the convoy." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Murphy could hear the distinctive whine of German diesel engines echoing off the hillsides, punctuated by the clank of track links and the grinding of gears as the convoy negotiated the rough forest road. His men were spread out in a loose skirmish line, waiting for orders that would determine whether they saw another sunrise. Through his field glasses, Murphy watched the German machine gun positions. Professional soldiers, probably veterans of the Russian front. They showed no sign of nervousness or haste. They'd done this before. Let American patrols stumble into the killing ground, then eliminate them before calling in their own artillery to break up any rescue attempt. Clean, efficient, and probably successful more often than not. "What do you think they're carrying in those trucks?" Kowalski whispered, his voice tight with nervous energy. "Ammunition, probably," Torres replied quietly. "Maybe fuel. Stuff their armor needs to keep pushing west." Murphy lowered his glasses, thinking about the bigger picture. The German winter offensive in the Vosges had caught the 3rd Infantry Division by surprise, forcing American units back from positions they'd held for weeks. Every supply convoy that got through meant more pressure on Allied lines, more casualties among units already stretched thin by months of fighting. But thinking strategically was a luxury when you had 18 men depending on your tactical decisions in the next few minutes. The radio crackled again. Captain Crawford's voice carried a new edge of urgency. Red 2, this is Red 6. Division wants immediate confirmation of convoy composition and size. Time is critical. Murphy took the handset from Martinez, keying the transmit button. Red 6, Red 2. Convoy confirmed, but we're looking at a prepared ambush position. Multiple machine gun nests on the ridgeline with interlocking fields of fire. Request instructions. The pause before Crawford's response lasted long enough for Murphy to watch the lead vehicle of the German convoy round a bend in the forest road. A SDK FZ-251 half-track, its angular silhouette unmistakable even through the morning mist. Behind it came 2 Opel Blitz trucks, their canvas-covered beds probably loaded with whatever supplies the German armor units needed to continue their advance. Red 2, you are ordered to maintain observation and direct artillery fire on that convoy. Battalion has guns standing by. Murphy stared at the twisted hull of the tank destroyer below them, understanding with perfect clarity what would happen next. The moment he called for fire, the German machine gunners would open up. His platoon would be pinned down in the open, taking casualties while trying to adjust artillery onto a moving target. Some of his men might survive long enough to see the convoy destroyed, but most wouldn't make it back to friendly lines. Lieutenant? Sergeant Johnson's voice on the radio carried the question they were all thinking. Follow orders and probably die, or find another way. The German convoy was passing the destroyed M10 now, close enough that Murphy could see individual soldiers sitting in the half-track. Young faces under steel helmets, probably as scared and tired as his own men. The war had taught him that the enemy suffered the same cold, the same fear, the same exhaustion that marked every day in the Vosges Mountains. They just happened to be on the wrong side of history. But recognizing their humanity didn't change the tactical reality. That convoy carried supplies for German units that would use them to kill American soldiers. Stopping it was worth considerable risk. The question was how much risk and who would pay the price. Murphy made his choice with the same instinct that had kept him alive through Sicily, Italy, and 6 weeks of fighting in eastern France. Not the choice the manual recommended, not the choice Captain Crawford expected, but the choice that might get his men home alive. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Martinez, get me artillery on the radio, Murphy said quietly, his voice carrying a calm that he didn't feel. But don't call the fire mission yet. The young radio man looked confused but complied, switching to the fire direction frequency while Murphy continued studying the German convoy through his field glasses. The half-track and trucks were moving slowly along the forest road, their drivers cautious on the rough terrain. In about 3 minutes, they'd reached the curve where the destroyed tank destroyer sat, the perfect spot to call artillery if you could survive long enough to adjust the fire. Johnson, when I give the word, I want you to take your squad and start moving back toward that depression we passed 5 minutes ago, Murphy continued. Fast and quiet, but don't run. Make it look like a tactical withdrawal. What about you? Johnson's voice carried the concern of a veteran non-com who'd seen too many young officers make heroic mistakes. Murphy was already moving, crawling down the slope toward the wrecked M10. I'm going to get closer to that tank destroyer. If I can reach it, I can call artillery from a position the machine gunners can't hit. It was insane, and every man in the platoon knew it. The destroyed M10 sat in perfect view of the German positions, at least 200 meters of open ground away from any cover. but it also sat at the exact spot where artillery would be most effective against the convoy, and its armored hull might provide protection from the machine gun fire that would inevitably come. "Sir, that's suicide," Torres whispered urgently. "Those Krauts will cut you down before you get halfway there." Murphy checked his rifle and gathered the spare ammunition from his cartridge belt. "Not if they're busy shooting at something else. Johnson, give me 30 seconds, then start your withdrawal. Make some noise. Let them think the whole platoon's pulling back." The German convoy was closer now, maybe a minute from the killing zone. Murphy could hear voices from the half-track, someone shouting orders in German, officers checking their map, probably, or pointing out landmarks along their route. Normal sounds of soldiers doing their job, about to become targets in someone else's war. From the ridgeline, there was no sign of the machine gunners, but Murphy knew they were there. Professional soldiers with good fields of fire and plenty of ammunition, waiting for American infantry to make exactly the kind of mistake he was about to make. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said urgently, "let me go with you. 2 rifles are better than 1. "Negative. I need you with Johnson's squad." Murphy looked back at his men one last time, seeing the mixture of fear and admiration in their faces. They thought he was being heroic, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. He couldn't live with watching that convoy escape while good soldiers died because he'd followed orders instead of using his head. "Martinez, when I reach that tank destroyer, I'll call for fire. Tell artillery we need quick fire, 3 rounds, then fire for effect. And tell them to make it fast. I won't be able to stay there long." The radio crackled with an incoming transmission from Captain Crawford, demanding an immediate status report. Murphy ignored it, focusing on the terrain between his position and the wrecked M10. Open ground mostly, with a few scattered rocks and 1 fallen tree that might provide momentary cover. Not much to work with, but it would have to do. The German half-track was rounding the final curve now, its engine noise echoing off the hillsides. In the back, Murphy could see soldiers with their weapons ready, scanning the forest for signs of American troops. They knew this was ambush country, but they probably thought the machine gun positions on the ridgeline made them safe from anything smaller than a full company attack. 30 seconds, Murphy said into his radio, then handed the artillery frequency handset to Martinez. "When I wave, call for fire on these coordinates." He gave the young soldier the grid numbers for the curve in the road, making sure Martinez repeated them correctly. Then Murphy was moving, scrambling down the hillside toward the destroyed tank destroyer with the desperate speed of a man who knew that hesitation meant death. Behind him, he could hear Johnson's squad starting their noisy withdrawal, cursing and crashing through the underbrush in a performance designed to convince the Germans that the American patrol was retreating in disorder. The ruse worked. As Murphy reached the halfway point in his dash toward the M10, he heard the distinctive chatter of MG-42 machine guns opening fire from the ridgeline, their bullets cracking through the air above Johnson's position. The German gunners were shooting at movement in the forest, trying to catch withdrawing Americans in the open. Murphy threw himself behind the fallen tree, breathing hard and checking his rifle. The tank destroyer was still 50 meters away, and the German convoy would reach the kill zone in less than a minute. From the ridgeline, he could hear officers shouting orders in German, probably directing their gunners to pursue the retreating Americans. The smell of diesel fuel and burned metal was stronger here, mixed with the January cold and the scent of pine needles. The destroyed M10 looked even larger from ground level, its turret twisted at an unnatural angle, but its hull still intact. If he could reach it, the armor might protect him from small arms fire long enough to call artillery. But first, he had to cross 50 meters of open ground, while German machine gunners were actively looking for targets. Murphy checked his watch, took a deep breath, and prepared to make the run that would either save his platoon or get him killed. In the distance, he could hear the German convoy approaching the curve, diesel engines and clanking tracks mixing with the sound of machine gun fire from the ridgeline. Murphy sprinted across the open ground with the desperate clarity that comes when death is measured in seconds. The German machine gunners were still focused on Johnson's withdrawing squad, their tracers arcing through the forest canopy behind him. But any moment now, they'd spot his movement and shift fire. He covered the 50 meters in what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than 20 seconds, diving behind the destroyed tank destroyer just as the first MG-42 burst chewed up the ground where he'd been running. The armored hull rang like a bell under the impact of rifle bullets, but it held, providing the cover he needed. From this close, Murphy could smell the burned interior of the M10, melted rubber, charred metal, and something else he didn't want to identify. The crew had died in here yesterday, probably instantly when the German anti-tank round penetrated the hull. Their sacrifice had seemed meaningless at the time, but now their destroyed vehicle might save American lives. The German convoy was rounding the curve, less than 100 meters away. Through a gap in the tank destroyer's armor, Murphy could see the half-track clearly, its commander standing in the passenger compartment, scanning the ridgeline where his own machine gunners were positioned. The German officer looked confident, secure in the knowledge that his flanks were protected. Murphy keyed the radio handset he'd carried in his dash across the open ground. Fire mission, grid 397542, German convoy in the open, 3 vehicles, troops in the open. Request immediate fire. The response came back crisp and professional. Shot over. Shot out, Murphy replied, then pressed himself against the tank destroyer's hull as machine gun fire from the ridgeline intensified. The German gunners had figured out where he was hiding, and bullets were spanging off the armor with increasing frequency. The M10's protection wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, one of them would get a clear shot. The first artillery round screamed overhead and exploded in the forest 50 meters beyond the convoy. Close, but not close enough. Murphy keyed the radio again, his voice steady despite the bullets cracking past his position. Add 50, fire for effect. But as he spoke, Murphy saw something that made his blood freeze. The German half-track had stopped, and soldiers were dismounting with the practiced efficiency of veterans who'd done this before. Instead of retreating from the artillery, they were preparing to assault his position. Someone had identified him as the American forward observer, and they intended to eliminate him before he could adjust fire. "Sir, this is Johnson," came his sergeant's voice over the platoon frequency. "We can see Krauts moving toward your position, at least 8 of them, maybe more." Murphy looked around desperately. The tank destroyer provided cover from the machine guns on the ridgeline, but it wouldn't stop a squad of German infantry with grenades and assault rifles, and he couldn't withdraw, not until the artillery found its target and destroyed the convoy. That's when he noticed something he'd missed in his initial dash for cover. The M10's main gun, a 3-inch anti-tank weapon, was damaged but not destroyed. The barrel was slightly bent from the explosion that had killed the tank destroyer, but the breech mechanism looked intact, and scattered around the fighting compartment were several unfired rounds, apparently overlooked by the German salvage teams. It was impossible, of course. Tank destroyers required a crew of 4 to operate effectively. The main gun alone needed a gunner, a loader, and a commander to be effective. But Murphy had grown up hunting in Texas, and he understood the basic principles. Point the gun at the target, load a round, pull the trigger. "Fire for effect! Fire for effect!" came the artillery controller's voice over the radio. "On the way!" Murphy crawled through the tank destroyer's rear hatch, breathing through his mouth to avoid the smell of what had happened to the original crew. The fighting compartment was cramped and damaged, but the gun controls were simpler than he'd expected. A hand wheel to traverse the turret, another to elevate the barrel, and a firing mechanism that looked similar to the rifles he'd been using since basic training. Outside, he could hear German voices getting closer. Someone was shouting orders, probably a sergeant directing the assault on his position. Murphy grabbed one of the 3-inch rounds, heavier than he'd expected but manageable, and wrestled it into the gun's breech. The mechanism closed with a solid click that echoed inside the steel compartment. Through the tank destroyer's periscope, Murphy could see the German half-track and trucks clustered around the curve in the road. Perfect targets, if he could hit them before the infantry assault reached his position. But he'd never fired a tank gun before, and the weapon's sight picture was nothing like the rifles and machine guns he knew. Artillery rounds were exploding in the forest around the convoy now, close enough to shower the German vehicles with dirt and fragments, but not close enough for direct hits. The enemy soldiers were using the confusion to advance on Murphy's position, probably planning to eliminate him before he could adjust the artillery fire. Murphy traversed the gun barrel toward the half-track, trying to remember everything he'd learned about leading moving targets. The vehicle was stationary now, but its crew was preparing to move, and he'd only get one shot before they scattered or his position was overrun. "This is it," he whispered to himself, settling behind the gun sight and trying to steady his breathing. Outside the tank destroyer, German infantry were advancing through the smoke and noise of the artillery barrage, their weapons ready and their movements coordinated. Professional soldiers who wouldn't make mistakes. Murphy's finger found the firing mechanism, and for a moment that stretched like hours, everything balanced on the edge of a trigger pull that would either save his platoon or announce his failure to the German assault team now closing on his position. The secret that would never appear in the after-action reports was simple. In that moment, crammed into a dead crew's fighting compartment with enemy soldiers advancing on 3 sides, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was more terrified than he'd ever been in his life. But he pulled the trigger anyway. The 3-inch gun fired with a concussion that slammed Murphy against the back wall of the fighting compartment, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. Through the smoke and dust, he saw the German half-track lurch sideways, its front end crumpled and steam rising from its engine compartment. Not a perfect hit, but close enough to disable the vehicle and scatter the infantry around it. Murphy was already loading another round when the German assault team reached the tank destroyer. He could hear them moving around the hull, shouting to each other in sharp, professional voices. Someone was trying to climb onto the rear deck, probably planning to drop grenades through the open hatches. The artillery barrage was intensifying now, rounds falling with increasing accuracy around the stalled convoy. Through the periscope, Murphy could see German soldiers abandoning their vehicles and running for cover in the forest. The supply run was blown, the mission accomplished, but he was still trapped inside a steel box with enemy infantry trying to kill him. "Lieutenant Murphy, this is Red 2 Alpha," Johnson's voice crackled over the radio. "We're moving to support your position. Hold on." But Murphy knew his squad was too far away to help in time. The German assault team was professional and thorough, systematically checking every angle of approach to the tank destroyer. In another minute, they'd figure out how to get grenades into the fighting compartment, and that would be the end of Second Lieutenant Murphy's war. That's when the artillery shifted fire, walking the barrage back toward the ridgeline, where the German machine gun positions were dug in. Someone, probably Johnson, had called for suppressive fire on the heights, and the German gunners were taking cover instead of providing overwatch for their infantry. Murphy seized the moment, grabbing his rifle and scrambling toward the rear hatch. He could hear at least one German soldier on the tank destroyer's deck, probably trying to position himself for a grenade throw. But the artillery barrage had created enough noise and confusion to mask Murphy's movement inside the hull. He came out of the hatch fast, his rifle already aimed, and found himself face to face with a young German soldier who looked as surprised as he was. For a fraction of a second, they stared at each other. 2 scared young men in a forest in eastern France, both a long way from home. Then training took over, and Murphy's rifle fired first. The German soldier fell backward off the tank destroyer's deck, his weapon clattering on the armor plate. Murphy spun around, looking for other targets, but the remaining assault team had withdrawn toward the forest road. The combination of artillery fire and unexpected resistance from inside the abandoned tank destroyer had convinced them to break contact. "Red 2, this is Red 2 Alpha." Johnson's voice came over the radio. "We can see you. German infantry is withdrawing toward the road. Looks like you got them spooked." Murphy slumped against the tank destroyer's turret, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. Around him, the forest reeked of cordite and diesel fuel, and the twisted wreckage of the German convoy smoldered under the continuing artillery barrage. The mission was complete, the enemy supply run disrupted, and his platoon was still alive. But as he watched smoke rising from the destroyed vehicles, Murphy felt the weight of what he'd done settling into his bones. Not the tactical victory. That was just another day's work in the 3rd Infantry Division. The weight came from knowing that he'd crossed a line somewhere inside that tank destroyer, discovered a capacity for violence that would stay with him long after the war ended. 20 minutes later, Captain Crawford arrived with the company's reserve squad, his face showing the mixture of relief and disbelief that Murphy had come to expect from senior officers. The after-action report would describe a successful reconnaissance mission that developed into an engagement with enemy forces, resulting in the destruction of a German supply convoy with minimal friendly casualties. The report wouldn't mention the terror Murphy had felt crawling through that tank destroyer, or the face of the young German soldier on the rear deck. It wouldn't describe the way his hands shook for an hour after the fight, or the dreams that would wake him decades later with the smell of diesel fuel and burned metal. "Hell of a thing, Murphy," Captain Crawford said, looking at the destroyed convoy and the machine gun positions on the ridgeline, now silent under the artillery barrage. "Battalion's going to want a full debrief." Murphy nodded, already thinking about how to translate what had happened into the clean language of military reports. Grid coordinates and casualty figures, tactical decisions and equipment expenditures, the machinery of war that turned young men's terror into neat lines on situation maps. But walking back through the Vosges Mountains toward friendly lines, Murphy carried with him the knowledge that some experiences couldn't be reduced to after-action reports. The destroyed tank destroyer would be salvaged or abandoned, the forest road repaired, and the war would continue its grinding progress toward an inevitable conclusion. What would remain was the memory of a morning in January 1945, when a scared young lieutenant from Texas learned that heroism and horror were often the same thing, viewed from different angles. The weight of that knowledge would stay with him through the remaining months of the war, through the medals and citations that followed, and through the long years afterward when people wanted to hear about the glorious moments, but not about the price of carrying them. In the official history, it would become another example of American initiative and courage under fire. In Murphy's private memory, it would always be the day he discovered that some kinds of strength could only be found by accepting how fragile you really were. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.